So, is it works? Is it grace? Is it the law? Is it faith? That's a discussion that Paul is dealing with in Romans chapter 4. He has established in chapter 1, Gentiles are lost. They cannot defend themselves that they did not have the Bible, because what could be seen of God was available in creation. Then in chapter 2, Jews are also wrong, because despite having the word, they did not obey it. So in chapter 3, he comes to a conclusion. All have fallen short of the glory of God. Romans 3:23. So now in chapter 4, he wants to show that the only available method for us to get forgiveness and be reconciled to God is not law, it is faith. Putting your trust in what? In God's grace, in His goodness. Just look at verse 13 in seeing what God is saying. And all the way to verse 17, he is emphasizing this. It was not through the law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise that he would be heir of the world, but through the righteousness that comes by faith. For if those who depend on the law are heirs, faith means nothing, and the promise is worthless, because the law brings wrath, and where there is no law, there is no transgression. Therefore, the promise comes by faith, so that it may be by grace and not by and may be guaranteed to all Abraham's offspring, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who have the faith of Abraham. He is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made you a father of many nations. He is our Father in the sight of God, in whom he believed, the God who gives life to the dead and calls into being things that were not. So here is the comparison we have to deal with. Is it by law or is it by faith? He said by stating it certainly cannot be by law. From the argument he has given from verse 1 to 12, surely by now we know it cannot be by law. Just look at verse 13. It was not through the law that Abraham and his husband received the promise that he would be heir of the world, but through this righteousness that comes by faith. Don't you see that Abraham, before the 2 commandments had been given, walked by faith, and on that basis, he was promised that he would be the father of faith, that he would have the offspring that will bring justice and righteousness to everybody else. So Abraham got his promise of blessing well before the law itself is given in Mount Sinai. And what's the promise? That Abraham, the childless patriarch, would actually be the heir, would be the parent of the heir to rule the whole world. What a blessing. So the first argument is it can't be that by the law. If you're using Abraham as an example, he himself was promised to be the father of Jesus Christ well before the law itself has been given. He simply trusted in God. And if you're in doubt, just look at him at Mount Moriah, sacrificing his own son, believing God can keep his promise with or without Isaac being dead or alive. That God is so capable beyond what Abraham can fathom, he is able to sort out the problem. So he gets his promise. Why? Not because he had fulfilled the law. The law had not been given, but because he trusted in God. And so I think the challenge Paul wants the Romans to understand is that similarly, if we want God's blessings, we also must walk by faith. In other words, every step of the way, you take a step because you trust your maker. You make a step because you trust his word. You take a step because you know he loves you and will take care of you. That's what you mean by walking by faith. You do not rely on the things you have performed because you know it's true you have done good things, but they are not good enough to deserve the kind of blessing that God is going to bring you away. And I think that's important. Then you look at your own life and see how many times you have failed. And yet, even if the failure was 1 out of 100, that failure is enough to deprive you of blessings. So you can't rely on what you have done yourself. You would have to rely on what God has done on the cross. So always picture Abraham has brought up this boy. The boy is wise enough to know there is a problem here. Take him to the mountain to be sacrificed. But he's asking, where is the lamb? How can we be sacrificing and I can't see something to sacrifice? And that boy, the young man, does not know that he is a sacrifice itself. Finally, the boy accepts. And the father is willing to cut him as a sacrifice. And that is what qualified Abraham as a father of faith. What is it that you are dealing with? And you realize the practical thing, the pragmatic thing is to do this and that and that. But you can see if you do that, it will be a sign that you don't trust God's ability. So what do? Trust him? Because he's saying if you trust him, then he will give you the Abrahamic blessing. He will bless you because you have trusted your life into him. In other words, even if he is telling what he is asking you to do doesn't make sense, like it cannot have made sense for Abraham to kill his own son, whom he has gotten in old age, and once he's dead, how will the promise be fulfilled? But he knew a God who can keep promise even without me or you understanding exactly what it is that he is doing or wants to do. I think that's something that we need to get into the back of our mind. Yes, you are fulfilling the law, will not do. Then in verse 14, he is saying, for if those who depend on the law are heirs, faith means nothing, and the promise is worthless. In other words, if the father of faith did not get what he got by trusting in God's promises, then it means the people who get promised their blessings are people who work for it. That's what he's saying. For if those who depend on the law, those who act, are the ones who are heirs, they are the ones who have the blessing, then to mean that trusting in God means nothing. And the promise earlier believed is worthless. So it means that if we are going to see the promises of God the Abrahamic way, we must of necessity be also people that are going to trust in that same God. Because if we get anything from God simply by what we do, then makes faith useless. And yet Paul is saying, no, what matters is, do you trust in God? Not what did you do and not do. There be people who do righteous acts better than you. But I have been told by works of the law, no one will receive salvation. It's a trusting, the faith in God. And I think that's an important thing we need to have at the back of our mind as to whether we are going to trust in God like that and believe that God can fulfill it. You know, there are 3 advantages of this. Number 1, when you realize that your works cannot be trusted, it will force you into prayer and walking with the Lord more. Because there's nothing, God owes you nothing, because you realize you can't trust your works. Number 2, it makes you not helpless. Because when you keep failing many times, sometimes you give up, feel like this thing is too much. But you realize the one forgiving is forgiving continuously. When you walk by trusting in his forgiveness, then it means you can never get into depression, feeling like I'm nothing, I cannot achieve much. No, because you are not walking by what you want. Number 3, when you understand that, even when you meet somebody much better than you, it does not intimidate you. Because you know none of us, the better one, the not too good one, all of us, none of us is accepted in God because of what we do or do not do. And I think that's something that will be important for us to look at. So if the inheritance, the blessings of God is by keeping the law, then faith is useless. Salvation will be a reward. It's something we have to work on. Then we now are forgiven. No. But that doesn't make sense. Look at verse 15. Verse 15 is saying, because the law brings wrath, and where there is no law, there is no transgression. Why can't you trust in the law? Because the law is a precursor of wrath, of punishments. And it will be broken anyway. Once the law is set, the one thing you can rest assured is that the law will be broken. The law will be broken. And if the law will be broken, then death is for real. All of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So it means that if we are going to rely on the law, then all of us are finished. Because the law just helps us to know we are sinners. The law, we can't keep the law. And God knows that. So verse 15 is actually telling you the law brings wrath. And where there is no law, there is no transgression. How would you know that you have done wrong if you haven't even been told what's wrong and right? And that's really why the argument Paul is giving is you can't trust yourself to get salvation through the law. You cannot expect you will please God by keeping the law, because you know how many times you have failed or can fail, or you will fail. Trust in God. And the moment you don't trust yourself, you trust God, then it means you can attempt almost anything as long as that's what God wants you to attempt. You attempt great things for God, trust Him to help to do it, and you will see them accomplished because you are not trusting in yourself. And I think that's something that will be important. So, Paul is right. The law brings wrath. As soon as you know what's wrong, like when I tell you don't stand up, you get tempted to stand up. And you stand up and you get the punishment, I promise you. But if only I had not told you there's a rule here not to stand up, would you have broken it? No. So he's saying there is no law. Where there is no law, there will be no transgression. You can't say you have failed. So, clearly, he has established it's foolish, it's not wise to try to please God by keeping the law. Because you can't. You are sure to end up in God's wrath. So what's the alternative? The alternative is faith. And that's what verse 16 is saying. Therefore, the promise comes by faith. In other words, the blessings of God, which he promised Abraham, if we are to get themselves, to get them ourselves, it means the promise comes by faith. It's by trusting. And if you trust in God, all the Abrahamic promises are become yours, even if you are not a physical Jew, because everything is working by faith. Therefore, the promise comes by faith. How do you hope, for example, to go to heaven? God has promised us heaven. How do you hope to make it? And yet you know how many times you have failed him since the day you said, I'm saved. How many times has a thought that contradicts God's requirements has come to your mind? Or ask yourself a different question. Even in the last 1 week, has there something happened that doesn't please God? If the answer is yes, that tells you that the only way you will enjoy God's promises is by trusting yourself into his arms and trusting his forgiveness and all the things he has promised to do. Verse 16 goes on, so that it may be by grace. The reason why it's impossible to finish, to do enough to please God other than trusting in God. It then means if you end up in heaven, it will not be because of what you did, because you knew whatever good you did was not good enough. It will be by grace. Because faith means faith in God's grace. Faith means trusting God's ability, God's goodness. So it is maybe by grace. And if it's by grace, then it is guaranteed to all people of faith, Abraham's offspring. Because if it's by grace, then anybody can manage. All they need is to trust in God. They are assured then that they will make it to heaven. So Paul is saying, if it's by grace, if it's by faith, it means it is what God can do. Grace means getting what you don't deserve. And that's what God's grace is. And it then means, if it's by grace, anybody like Abraham who trusts in God is sure to make it to heaven. And it's given not only to those who are of the law, even if your background is as a Jew and you knew getting baptized, doing this, doing that, that's the way you started your life, the people of the law. You still can stop trusting in the law and start trusting in God. Those also, the promise is for them also, the moment they realize they can't trust themselves in the law. But also, this promise is for those who have the faith of Abraham. Whether you have trusted in the law in the past, now you trust in God. But if you have somebody who trusted in the faith of Abraham, then you are assured of these promises that Abraham was given. You know why? He is the father of us all. Anybody who walks by faith, the precursor of a walk of faith, is Abraham. So we all become his children. We all become people as heirs. That's why Paul is calling, he is the father of us all. It doesn't matter whether you're a Gentile or a Jew. Now Abraham become the father of us all. It doesn't mean whether you are rich or you are poor, whether you are tall or you are short. Paul concludes that if you're a man of faith whose righteousness is not your works, it is your trust in God, then Abraham is your father. And I think that's something that's very, very encouraging as you think about it. That faith makes you and me a child of Abraham. And because we become the child of Abraham, like we are repeating, you now can inherit the promises of Abraham. So you There are people who are Abraham's seed by faith. There are people who are Abraham's seed by blood. But if you are the Abraham's seed by blood, but you don't put your trust in God, then you can't enjoy Abraham's promises. Look at verse 17. And just talking about the same thing. Look at verse 17. As it is written, I have made you a father of many nations. In other words, clearly, right with God's intention in picking on Abraham, was not to just bless his biological children. Because the promise says, I'm going to make you a father of many nations. That means one nation will be people of your offspring, but there will be other nations that will claim your fatherhood, although you never gave birth to them, and they have no biological connection with you. So this idea about the family of faith being connected with Abraham was predicted right from the time God is giving the promise. And he's saying, I have made you a father of many nations. So you need to understand, whoever comes saying, Christianity is a foreign religion, you need to show it. The intention right from several thousands years ago when God was speaking to Abraham, he intended it, not for the Jews alone, but for all of us, that Abraham, by faith, will become the father of all the nations. And I think that's something that we need to have at the back of our mind. If truth be told, Paul says, he is our father in the sight of God. In other words, the Jews may not accept us, Gentiles, but they are not being requested. It's God himself. He is our father in the sight of God. It's God who has made him, who has made Abraham our father. He is our father as far as God is concerned. I think that's something that we need to have at the back of our mind. That when God, who is not a God of the Jews, is a God of the universe. And if you are doubting that, just read the book of Genesis. He is the creator of all things, heaven and earth. He is a creator. It's only along the way he chooses Abraham's seed to demonstrate his love for others. So I think it will be very important, because if that be true, then it means that what matters is, if God sees you as a child of Abraham, does it matter what other people think? Oh, this is a Jewish religion. That's not, that Paul is arguing. No. He's telling the Romans, who are Gentiles, many of them. No. He is the father of the Romans in the sight of God. Why? In whom we believed, because we trusted in God. That's how you become a child of Abraham. By trusting. We have believed, we trusted in God, in God. Who do we trust? The God who gives life to the dead. In other words, he's the author of life. So somebody can be dead and he can raise him from the dead. Isn't that what he did through his son Jesus Christ? He raised many people. And that's what God is saying. You have put your trust in this God who gives life to the dead. And also this God who calls into being things that are not. That's why he created. In other words, let there be man. There was a man or three he molded from the earth. Let there be a light. And there was light. So he's preparing the Romans to understand the implication of being connected to Abraham. He is the father. This Abraham is the father in the sight of God. Which God? In whom we believed. Which God? The God who gives life to the dead. Which God? The God who calls into being things that were not. Now that he creates something out of nothing. That human beings don't do that. You must give human beings something to start with. Then they'll create wonderful, wonderful things. But if the truth be told, there was always a basic material which they themselves never created. But God, that we trust in, can create something out of nothing. And that's how he was able to help the Abraham when he was biologically not able to father, and the wife could not get pregnant. He can create something out of nothing. He created a child for Abraham. And he's saying that's the God we believe in. That's the one we trust in. That's why he's able to forgive us. He's able to walk with us and make us children of Abraham by faith. He calls into being things that were not. Instead of trying to cover up, you can see what God actually wants to achieve through your life. So what are we saying then? That Christianity is not a Jewish religion. Paul is laboring to get that fact out. That for sure, Christianity traces to Abraham before he was a Jew. You see, he was a man from the East who was picked among pagan worshippers and followed God. So that's a lesson we learn from, and Paul wants us to learn. Christianity, the church in Rome, the church in Jabine, your church, Christianity is not a Jewish religion because it traces itself to a time before the Jews even existed. And Judaism started with the Moses and the law. And I think that will be something important for us to have. And what does Christianity imply? I think it will be important to understand it is not just a group of rituals, although there are rituals in Christianity. It is something to do with fulfilling God's promises. So keeping rituals does not bring you Christianity. Although there's nothing wrong with rituals themselves, but they don't save. So backsliding really is when not walking by faith. Because Christianity is a walk of faith, trusting yourself in God's hands. So when you start walking, I know the law, I can follow it. When you start saying, oh, but I can never do wrong. If you get that picture, you are actually backsliding. Because backsliding is when you are not walking by faith. You are not walking in trust of God. And you are trusting yourself rather than trusting God himself. And that's really what we must come up with. That it's not by the works of the law we get salvation. It's by faith in the God of Abraham. And walking and trusting ourselves into his hands. That's what will help us in fulfilling what God intends for us. And this is a real game changer. When John Wesley, the founder of Methodist, tried to please God and he was suffering and struggling and pain and guilt continuously, then he discovered this teaching. We are saved by grace through faith. When he discovered it, he was able to be relieved. And here is, since it's a gift, he can receive it. And my prayer is that it's not just our friend John Wesley who will experience, you will experience. It's the same thing with Martin Luther. He struggled, he wanted to please God until he discovered, it's not what you do, it's what you believe. And obviously what you do will follow, but it's following. It's not the precursor, it's not the one that sets the ball rolling. May the Lord help us to truly walk by faith and not by sight. And because we are walking by faith, may we not displease the God who has promised to be with us and to help us. May we truly walk in righteousness because we trust in him.